Okay. We would also like to thank the staff members and teaching assistants of the Political Science Department who have helped make this event come to light. And now on to today's event. So Dr. Floyd will start speaking for about 40 minutes, where she will give her views on climate politics and securitization theory. After that, we will have about 30 minutes for a general Q&A session and an open discussion where you can all participate through the chat box. So please mute your microphones while Dr. Floyd is speaking. And if you have any questions, then please wait until the Q&A session starts. And during the Q&A session, please write your questions in the chat box, and we will read your questions to Dr. Floyd from the chat box. So Rita, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so COVID is a little while ago. Let me just see, how on earth do I start the slideshow? Oh, from up here. Here we go. The animations have been done by my 12-year-old son. So you see some fancy changes of the sort of PowerPoint slides of the kind that I don't actually know how to do, but he was quite animated doing that. I should also say, I said it earlier, but perhaps not all of you were here. I have quite a bad cold. That's why I sound so nasal, because my sort of sinuses are all stuffed up. But also I might start coughing at some point, and that might go on for a little while. So if that happens, just bear with me. I will come back when the coughing has stopped. Okay, so my talk today is called The Climate Emergency, Navigating Cacophony with Securitization Theory. And incidentally, cacophony, if you don't know that word, it doesn't have anything to do with coughing, although it kind of sounds like it. It's more to do with, it's a sort of level of noise. I think it has negative connotations, which I don't really mean. I simply just mean there is a lot of noise made on this topic of climate emergency or climate security. And in a way, how can we find our way through that? And it is indeed a chapter for a book, one that's edited by Anne LeHolland and Richard Matthew. And it's going to be a handbook, I think, for Edward Elgar. And they asked me to write a chapter on securitization and climate change. I thought, well, what can I do? Because obviously I've written about this in the past, including for another handbook, and I didn't want to write the same thing. So I've actually managed to write something new, which I'm quite pleased about. Okay, so let's get started then. So as regards the state of climate security or awareness of the climate emergency, I would say that pretty much every time you open the newspapers, you get an article of this kind. You know, the global climate crisis is inevitable. You get some sort of natural disaster somewhere in the world, or some extreme weather event that is somehow linked to climate change. You then sit down in the evening, perhaps to watch TV, and you have prominent individuals and nature shows telling you, you know, climate change is the thing that is threatening life of different species and plants, but also ultimately of the way we live. Climate change is taught at school. I just mentioned I have a son, I have a daughter as well, and my daughter certainly, who is slightly younger, is very worried about climate change because they are taught about climate change at school, and there's this sort of partial, only a partial understanding on part of the children. You know, what is this? What can we do about it? And is this really worrying? So I actually tend to, in front of my children, probably play the problem down, because I don't want them to be afraid. You might be traveling somewhere and you might be stopped in your tracks by some climate activists, or even if you haven't seen them in person, you certainly hear about them in the press as well, because they are in the press repeatedly. Or you might listen to Antonio Guterres, who's the head of the UN, who has said quite a lot on climate change in quite striking language, you know, talking about a road to hell, and we have reached tipping points and so on. So this, I think, cover image is quite, captures him and his message quite well. The news media reports, just like, you know, this is the BBC, reports just like newspapers, of course, on climate change, but you also have some figures you wouldn't expect to be speaking out for climate action, such as here, the Hollywood actor Leonardo DiCaprio. And of course, politicians. This is Ursula von der Leyen, in case you're not sure who this is. She is the head of the European Commission. And of course, the European Union has been quite a significant actor on climate action. There are also some people who've come to attention of the world only because of climate change. Most notably, I would say Greta Thunberg, who is this Swedish teenage climate activist who really, I would say, is known the world over, and who is in some ways, I guess, the face of the young generation of people that are worried about climate change. And then there are also, of course, images such as this one, you know, the sort of quite captivating image of a polar bear on the remaining bit of ice. And of course, much has been made of the fate of polar bears and their ability to hunt in the ever diminishing sea ice. Now, what I've just given you is, of course, very much a sort of perspective of somebody who consumes British and German media, right? So that's what I'm exposed to. That's what I see and I hear. And I don't know what you're exposed to in Egypt, what the media is reporting, but certainly even when you Google climate change in Egypt, you can find a fair bit on it. Obviously, what came to the attention or climate change, I'm sure that, and you can tell me later in the Q&A whether I'm wrong about this, I'm sure that the profile of climate change in Egypt would have been raised by the COP27, which of course was in Egypt. And in fact, you know, that was a COP that featured quite a few, or more so than previous COPs, African states and also states from the Arab world who now recognize climate change as an issue and want to do something about it. You get lots of reports about, you know, how will Egypt be affected by climate change? I don't know. This is not something I'm terribly familiar with. I merely have it here as a sort of to show you, you know, that it's not only a British and German or a Western European issue. I think climate change is kind of everywhere these days, and Egypt certainly has a national climate change strategy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with and probably have even looked at in detail. But my claim merely is that the climate emergency is real, certainly in the minds of many people. There are, of course, also some people who reject climate change or reject this idea that we should act on climate change, certainly with securitization. But overall, I think we can say that the vast majority of people nowadays accept that climate change is somehow linked to security, and they talk in those terms. But I think it's very messy, the whole situation. There is so much noise. Everybody talks at once, and often quite wildly different actors with different agendas. So the question is, you know, how can we find a way through this? Who does what in this climate security equation? Why do they do it? And to what effect? And that's essentially the research question of this talk, or the aim. My aim is to sort of shed some light on this. And I propose that we can get some help if we use securitization theory to untangle some of these issues that are at stake here. Now, I'm pretty sure that you also know a fair bit about securitization theory already. I want to give a very brief overview of the sort of traditional reading that was proposed by the Copenhagen School, because that's the sort of basis from which we start. So even if you do know the theory already, it's quite good to sort of refresh your mind sometimes. So securitization theory essentially holds that security operates like an illocutionary speech act, which means that issues become or come into existence as a result of being spoken about in a particular way. So an issue becomes a security threat when actors follow a particular grammar of security. And these are called the securitizing actors in the language of the Copenhagen School. Now, this grammar of security has several components to it. The Copenhagen School specifies there has to be an existential threat to a valued referent object. The securitizing actor has to specify a point of no return, meaning, unless we act now, we will not be here. I think Antonio Guterres's various speeches on climate change are pretty indicative of that kind of language. And there's also this call of necessity. It may be necessary to do something extraordinary about these issues. Now, of course, if that is how issues become security threats, then there's no stopping security or no stopping the securitization, because in principle, anybody declaring X or Y as a threat, is an existential threat to a valued referent object, etc., has then securitized the issue. So for this reason, the Copenhagen School includes a range of limiters into the theory. They are, in fact, I would say, quite concerned about the agenda of security becoming too wide and security therefore becoming meaningless. And there's a range of limiters. One prominent one is this issue of audience acceptance. So it's not enough simply to speak security, but an audience needs to accept this securitizing move. And also, of course, the fact that they insist on existential threats already is a limiter as well, because there are things below the threshold of existential threats, such as vulnerabilities or risk, etc., that may very well be securitized. And then finally, one of the other things the Copenhagen School do is they say, well, okay, so anybody is in principle able to utter a securitizing move. They might even convince an audience, but there are still those securitizations that are more interesting than other securitizations. And the thing that makes some securitizations more interesting than others is when extraordinary measures are used and rules that ordinarily bind are broken. So they differentiate on the one hand between rhetorical securitization, or you might call it securitization simpliciter, so just a generic kind of securitization, versus, and I put this in inverted commas, successful securitization, because successful is not quite the correct term, although that is the term the Copenhagen School use. It's more a sort of completed or securitization, or rhetorical plus securitization. So that is the kind of securitization that includes extraordinary measures. Okay, do you see what I mean about the PowerPoint slides? Now, if we apply this Copenhagen School framework to the many actors I've shown you, and of course there are very many others as well, we would say, well, who is the securitizing actor? Surely it has to be anybody speaking security. So all of those many people that declare a climate emergency, such as Greta Thunberg, such as Antonio Guterres, such as von der Leyen, and many, many others are all fall into the same box. They are securitizing actors. Then we have this category of referent object. And in fact, we ought to acknowledge that the Copenhagen School also gave us a pretty good terminology to talk about security, a terminology that we didn't have before. So the referent object is the thing that is supposedly threatened, and that is also meant to be secured or made safe via securitization. And in climate security, that can be a whole range of things. It can be people, livelihoods. It can be civilization. For some, it's the natural environment, which may even be anti-people, because of course it's the people that are doing the damage in the first place. It can be future people, so people that don't yet exist. It might be the poor, because they are the most affected by climate change, because they are unable to adapt meaningfully to these new weather conditions, for instance. Or it could be specific species or habitats. And then it could also be something which seems quite odd, I guess, such as the military. You know, that the military is threatened by environmental change because the armed forces aren't able to train and fight as they used to because of the conditions in the weather. And therefore, it is actually national security that is at stake, not merely, or not to downplay it, but not the natural environment, but all of national security, partly because the military is at risk of becoming defunct because of climate change. Now, what about the audience then? Who or what is the audience in all of this? Well, I would say whatever the audience is depends slightly on who your securitizing actor is. Because, of course, the audience presumably is the people or groups of people that securitization is addressed to. It's not always seen as such in the literature, but we might say also, and that is more what the literature says, that the audience somehow is there to give legitimacy to the securitizing actor. You know, the audience essentially ticks off this, yes, it is a security threat, yes, do what you need to do. So they're the ones that need to consent to securitization for it to go ahead. And then it could, of course, be a range of actors. It could be the citizens of a given state in institutions like the European Union or NATO. It could be the member states themselves. Or, in fact, it could also be powerful elites. So when someone like a climate activist talks or speaks about climate security, they are addressing powerful elites, aren't they? They want for the elites to do something. That's the sort of aim of what they're doing. But I think we can also see that, well, no, I'm not sure I'm going to go there, because obviously some of you might know that I have quite different views about the audience to some other scholars. I'll go there in a later slide. Let's look at them. When is securitization complete? Again, in the Copenhagen School's version. So one would be when there's audience acceptance, then you have rhetorical securitization, or second, when extraordinary measures are adopted. So that would be in addition to the audience acceptance. Okay, so there are a few problems with this. First of all, it strikes me as slightly problematic that there is no difference between the likes of Greta Thunberg, Antonio Guterres, Joe Biden, NATO, etc. All of these different people or institutions, according to the Copenhagen School, would be securitizing actors, because they are declaring climate change is a security threat, we need to act now. They, in other words, are following the grammar of security, and arguably all of them have convinced a relevant audience that this is so. But it seems to me that actually they are different. They have quite different powers. You know, they're different actors. One is an individual with no what I call executors of securitization, meaning police or armed forces that she is in charge of. While the other ones, I mean, certainly someone like Joe Biden or NATO, the head of NATO, are in an entirely different position in terms of what they could actually do. But I think more relevant than that is, I think they intend quite different things when they speak security. And that, to me, is the sort of key point I'll come back to in terms of what do they want to achieve when they declare a climate emergency. So you might say, okay, we accept there is this problem in securitization theory, so let's have as a solution that we insist on the adoption of extraordinary measures, because surely, you know, if we say rhetoric is not enough to identify securitizing actors, let's also look for extraordinary measures. But there's a problem with that as well, because as we shall see, and as you probably know, at this point in time, the powerful actors, so the actors that could enact an exceptional securitization, have not done so, but they have declared a climate emergency and they have subsequently changed their behavior in line with that declaration. But that change of behavior hasn't been exceptional. The question is that a case of securitization or not? And there are different views on that, but it seems to me if securitization theory is constructivist all the way down, whereby the actors or the practitioners make the decision of the meaning of security, then the analyst can't really come along and say, well, I'm sorry, but you haven't enacted extraordinary measures, therefore it's not securitization. But the other thing also is that we do have quite a range of actors who do use extraordinary measures because of the climate emergency. You know, people that slash the tires of SUV drivers, that block oil refineries, that block the traffic, etc. People who practice civil disobedience. But again, here the problem is, what is their intention? Do they do this with the view to addressing the issue? Do they think that their actions will reduce climate emissions? Probably not, right? They probably want to achieve something else. Another solution might be to say, we need to define how large the audience has to be in order to be able to legitimate securitization. And that's actually something that's missing from securitization theory, as far as I know. And nobody said, well, the audience has to be sufficiently large and give some sort of definition to be able to legitimate securitization, because that would, for instance, stop cases whereby you would have say a right-wing terrorist who of the kind as we've seen them, you know, in various countries, who goes out and on a rampage and has the support by like-minded people on the internet, a small number, but arguably you could say, you know, that is would serve as an audience for this person, and they therefore feel that they have more legitimacy to undertake these acts. So you would then be able to exclude such cases. I leave that one open. But I think there's another problem with the securitization approach as we have it from the Copenhagen School. Most of the actors are pressed into the category of either referent object or audience. When the Copenhagen schools themselves actually identify the category of functional actor. They say, you know, a functional actor is an actor that is neither the securitizing actor nor the referent object that plays a significant part in securitization, but it's not further theorized what they actually do. So you have to forensically look through the text to find out who actually are the functional actors. Okay, so we can see that the Copenhagen School can help us a little bit with cutting through this noise of the climate emergency. But it lacks, the theory as they have it, certainly a clear delineation between who does what, and sometimes leads to confusion, because I think not everyone speaking security is a securitizing actor. The audience needs to be defined. That is a perennial problem, although a lot has been written on that nowadays. But also, what about the media? Where do they come into it? Surely they play a major role in this. what kind of actor actually is the media in this? So here's my solution. I propose we need to look at the different categories of actor in securitization again, and we need to look at them through the lens of a functional distinction. And that's not actually something I've come up with, but you can find that in Security and New Framework for Analysis. So it is there in the Copenhagen School text. The Copenhagen School holds, and this is the context in which they most explicitly talk about a functional distinction, that scholars are functionally distinct from securitizing actors. What does that mean? Well, it means that broadly, as scholars of securitization, it's simply our job to examine what is what. We don't make securitization. You know, they don't think that we as actors are really part of the securitization process. And it is the job of actors to make security. So our job is to sit back and look at who does what. And it's also, in a way, not our job to endorse or reject a particular securitization. Of course, that isn't entirely true, because there are certain problems with this, because if language is performative, then the securitizing analyst also inadvertently fosters a particular securitization, and therefore they then have to take a position on it. But in principle, the idea is there is a functional distinction. The primary objective of the scholar is not to make some sort of value judgment and to say there is a real threat, we think you should do X. And of course, that is down to the securitizing actor. So I take this idea of the functional distinction very seriously. And back in, I think it was published in either 2020 or 21, I wrote an article called The Functions of Functional Actors that was published in Critical Studies on Security. And in it, essentially, I try and excavate from the writings of the Copenhagen School, what is this category of functional actor? And this is a table that is from this article. So let me just talk you through this briefly. So in the paper, I say, well, securitizing actors are those people, and only those people, who utter securitizing moves and enact emergency measures, either by changing their own behavior or by instructing executors of securitization they're in a position of power over. So only if you speak security with a view to then changing your own behavior, or with a view to instructing someone you're in the position of power over to change their relevant behaviors, are you meaningfully called a securitizing actor. Anybody else who speaks security, but who seeks to convince more powerful and strategically positioned actors of the need to securitize, is better referred to as securitization requester. Okay, so someone like Greta Thunberg would be a securitizing requester who asks, essentially, when she goes to the UN and says, you've done nothing but blah, 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 we want you to do something more. That's what she seeks to do. So she declares a climate emergency, not with a view to changing her own behavior, which I'm sure she already has changed anyway, but with a view to convincing powerful actors to change their relevant behaviors in response to the climate emergency. I mentioned up here, executor of securitization. That is another category I introduce because essentially quite often the securitizing actor, certainly in state-led securitizations, they're not the ones who will on the street carry out the securitization. Rather, that will be the task of police, of border guards, of the military, or sometimes, as it was with COVID, of healthcare professionals. Okay, so it's a different kind of group of people, often professionals, security professionals and others, depending on whatever the nature of the threat is at that point in time. Of course, in securitization by non-state actors, this is likely to break down because there won't be that many people. So the securitizing actor will probably also be involved in the execution of securitization. Let's move on to the audience. So I think that the audience in securitization, in the securitization literature, has been hugely overblown. I think that the fact that we have on the one hand the terminology of Speech Act, on the other hand the terminology of audience is important. It must mean that surely that the audience is whoever the Speech Act is directed towards, right? So if you're saying something, who are you actually talking to? And now to uncover who the audience is in securitization, we must ask ourselves, what does a securitizing actor actually do when they speak security? And the two things that have been identified on that front by Ole Weber, who of course invented this whole concept in the first place, was this act of promising and the act of warning. Now, if those are the two things that are being done in securitization, there are only two audiences. One is the referent object, who is promised protection with securitization. The other one is the threatener, who is essentially being warned off with securitization. And audiences, do they legitimate securitization? Well, it certainly helps if the referent object, in a democracy at least, says, yes, we think securitization should go ahead because we believe you're the best actor to save us from this threat, and you have our full consent. Then that probably does make a difference, but it doesn't categorically make a difference. And it is for this reason that I always bracket the audience as a categorical category from securitization. But audiences, of course, can veto or endorse securitization on behalf of themselves. And this brings me to the category of functional actor. Now, functional actors, I think, are hugely important. And most of the time, what my colleagues and peers in securitization theory talk about when they talk about audiences, they really talk about functional actors. Because, of course, tons of people comment on the value or disvalue of securitization on behalf of others. Every time, something happens in the US, for instance, you will find things in the media. Is this the right way to go about it? Should this be endorsed? Shouldn't this be, or should this be vetoed? Those kinds of actors are functional actors. And I'll explain a bit more what they are in a minute on the example of climate change. We also have, as a final category, securitization preempters. These are actors that seek to stop securitization from happening before, before it happens, if you like. So they seek to stop it before an actor actually declares there is an emergency and changes their behavior in response to a threat. Okay, let's move on. Let's now apply these categories to climate security. So we then have to ask ourselves, if we look at this complicated picture of the climate emergency again, who actually speaks climate security with the view to acting on it, right? To who can meaningfully do that? Because there's also, not everybody can meaningfully do that. And I would say the relevant entities here are governments, international institutions, including NATO and the European Union. This is, of course, a picture here of Jens Stoltenberg, and climate security played quite a significant role in the NATO 2030 strategy. And these actors have spoken security, but by and large, what they have done in response to this securitizing move has not been extraordinary. For the most part, the hopes at the moment are staked on a carbon emissions reduction regime, as well as the green energy revolution. So a lot is happening, But what is happening is possible within the normal rules of the game. You know, nobody has suspended, for instance, people from driving their cars for pleasure. Nobody has stopped me and others from going on holiday this year, flying to wherever it is I'm going to. You know, there haven't been restrictions on our behavior. There haven't been restrictions on industry. And, you know, just a few years ago, it would have been quite difficult to actually even visualize what that might look like. But because we've all lived through COVID, we now know what that looks like. We know what those restrictions might mean, and we know that we don't have them as yet. But then there's another question as regards securitization, and I've already touched on this. If securitization, or the meaning of security and securitization, is supposed to be constructivist all the way down, there's again this question, who are we to say it's not securitization when actors actually view their actions as a security response to a threat? And I would say that is how most of the government and international institutions actually view what they're doing. So it is perhaps not always right to say securitization, or to counter successful securitization, the policy change has to be extraordinary. But perhaps we should listen instead to what the practitioners think. Now, I'm sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Because securitization hasn't been extraordinary in the way I've just described, we haven't seen executors of securitization, meaning police and military, going out to enforce extraordinary measures, to enforce restrictions of movement, to, you know, to stop us from, I don't know, commuting when we could work from home, in an effort to bring down carbon emissions. But there are cases where executors of securitization are involved in the wider climate security conundrum, particularly in Germany, where there have been preemptive prison sentences for people who have protested against climate inaction. They call them the Klimakleber, which literally translates as the climate gluers, so the people that glue themselves onto the road. You can see this in this picture here, and this is the example clearly of a person here who spent 2 weeks, but I've heard of longer prison sentences, preemptively. You know, they said essentially, we will do it again, and were then locked up to stop them from doing yet another thing. And this was actually legislation that was initially brought in under the terrorism legislation, and is obviously hugely contentious. But similar things are happening in other countries. In the UK, for example, a few climate activists apparently are lost in the system on remand, so they haven't sort of been seen yet. But of course, what's different about this, the logic here, is that here, the referent object is not the climate, but it's state sovereignty. You know, these people are undermining, or to an extent, threatening state sovereignty. Even if not really, it doesn't matter. They are perhaps perceived as such. You know, has the state lost control because it can't keep these people in check? Okay, securitization requesters. So I said earlier, these are people who request securitization of others, who want powerful elites to do something. Very likely, they would like something extraordinary to be done about the climate emergency. And it is in this category I would put the tire slashers, as I put it here, the pipeline saboteurs, the oil refinery shutdown people, all of these sort of climate activists that at the moment are practicing mostly sabotage and general low-level disruption. But I wouldn't be surprised if in future you will see forms of climate terrorism. And the thing that sets these people apart from securitizing actors is the intention. They don't think that their actions, sitting there on the steps, protesting themselves, I'm sure, living largely in terms of carbon emissions, very good lives, very carbon neutral lives, will actually change anything. They realize this can only be done from the top to the bottom, in a way. We need action at a higher level. We need this mandated from the state. We need this to be a priority. That's what they want to achieve. So in this securitization process, then, who is the audience? Who is being promised protection with securitization by our governments, for example? I would say, well, it's definitely people, ordinary living people, who have to accept these, what's going on, who have to be able to understand why the government is doing some of the things it's doing. Clearly, they want to have some sort of moral legitimacy for what they're doing. But of course, referent objects also include future people and non-human species, none of who could actually meaningfully assent to securitization, which is also partly why I think the category of the audience or the audience consenting is not that relevant. But is there another type of audience in securitization? Are there actually any threateners in securitization who are being warned off with securitization rhetoric? And the reason why we have to ask that is because you have to ask yourself, are there actually any threateners at all? Because, of course, nobody deliberately created climate change, right? Nobody wanted for there to be climate change. And I don't think even now climate change deniers think we need to deliberately create this problem, because climate change is not an agent intended threat. Nobody intended for there to be climate change, but still agents, of course, play a role in it. Initially, they played a role in it because they were oblivious to the problem. Their polluting happened. Nobody knew it would lead to these problems down the line. So it's agent caused, but not intended, in my terminology. Initially by obliviousness, but now, of course, that we all are aware of what kinds of behavior cause climate change, including, as I said earlier, our children. I think anybody who refuses to act on climate change is, in a way, culpable for harmful behavior. So it's a form of neglect. It's harmful neglect to not acknowledge climate change or to not act on climate change. And there are, of course, a few individuals that come to mind in this context. I've got here a picture of Jair Bolsonaro, who was the Brazilian president until fairly recently. And of course, he was very much, not acting, to put it in the mildest possible terms, against deforestation of the Brazilian rainforest, which in turn can bring about climate tipping points and so on. So it's not just a localized problem, but it actually has global consequences. And I think that the climate emergency and probably more tailored rhetoric can also be seen as a warning. Certainly, in principle, unless you stop acting in this way, we will have to do something. I don't say this has happened yet, but it's certainly possible in the future. Oh, sorry, I just didn't want to do that. Let me just go back. I thought I had another point. And Stephen Walt, interestingly, I think in 2019, I think it was in foreign policy, he contemplated the possibility of an armed environmental intervention on a sort of hypothetical, but clearly aimed at, would there be down the line the possibility of armed environmental intervention to stop somebody like Bolsonaro destroying the rainforest because of climate change. And that certainly is something I think in the future that is a possibility. Okay, then let's look at functional actors. So I said earlier, functional actors, oh my goodness me, sorry about that. There we go. I was trying to move the pictures, the camera pictures to the side so I can read my writing up there. So functional actors are actors who veto or endorse securitization on behalf of others. Remember that audiences do so on behalf of themselves. So in a way, in this category, we can list all the actors that are not securitizing actors, that are not securitizing requesters, and that are not audiences, but that have something to say about securitization. And you will see this category probably includes yourselves. So we have, and then of course we can break this down into specific categories because there's so many functional actors that again, we need to specify it a bit more. So in the article I've written on this, I identified gatekeeper as one functional actor. And in the climate security context, this would be, for instance, the papers I've shown you earlier, The Guardian, but also The Independent, each one of which is clearly committed to raising awareness of the climate emergency. The Guardian even has a whole section called The Climate Crisis. But there are also other actors, for instance, Fox News, who are positioned at the other end of the spectrum and practice a form of climate change denialism. But both of them operate quite similarly. They want to only let one message through to their readers, and therefore they are best classified as gatekeepers. So The Guardian and The Independent would endorse securitization. Fox News would clearly be speaking out against it quite vigorously. A second type of category is that of legitimator, or in fact, delegitimator. Into this category, I put Parliament. If Parliament is asked, which they aren't always, to pass, to comment on, or to vote rather, on a new security decision, their support, of course, is good and is probably likely to influence the decision to go ahead with something or not. But they aren't always or necessarily asked because, of course, in security situations, sometimes Parliament is simply circumvented and the executive makes the decision. But also a legitimator can be those that are most affected by climate change. I'm thinking here in particular of geoengineering. If we have down the line forms of geoengineering, I'm pretty sure it will be done with reference to the small islands nations that are at risk of sinking into the sea. Now, if a securitizing actor could show consent from the affected people, it would give the securitization a form of moral legitimacy. It doesn't mean they need it for the securitization to go ahead, but it is likely that they would seek that kind of legitimation. The same with hegemonic power. Quite often smaller powers will seek the endorsement of the hegemonic power for whatever it is they are seeking to do. So there are different forms of legitimation. Another important functional actor in the securitization of climate change are epistemic communities. You all know the IPCC, of course. This is a report that is essentially written together by academics from a huge number of different fields. It's a sort of systematic review that brings together the latest evidence on the science of climate change. That's essentially how we all know that climate change is a problem. But also it includes chapters by social scientists, including, for instance, one on human security a few years ago. And of course, there are umpteen other reports where academics get together and speak out against usually for the securitization of climate change. And then you have very few who would, I think, really a select minority that speak out against the securitization of climate change. I don't think the climate deniers really form an epistemic community, but rather they belong into this category here, where they are sort of rebels that fight existing norms or this existing position, or that veto securitization. Often that can be just ordinary people who do so with the help of social media, but sometimes it's also established academics. In the climate context, the person who comes to mind is Björn Lomborg, who you probably are too young to remember, had a very famous book, I think in 2001, called The Skeptical Environmentalist. And his argument is essentially remained the same ever since in successive books, which always has been environmental degradation or climate change is a problem, yes, but there are other problems that we need to address first, and they really have priority. So that essentially is his argument. And then you have sometimes whole political parties who contest the securitization narrative, such as here, the AfD, that's the Alternative for Germany, that has a whole commitment essentially to putting Germany back on what they see as the right path away from the securitization of climate change, away from green energy. And then you also have other powerful individual persons who act as functional actors. Earlier we saw Leonardo DiCaprio, who you will know. You may or may not know David Attenborough. Okay, my headphones just dropped out, but I seem to be back. David Attenborough, you might know, is a naturalist, very famous certainly in Great Britain. And these people, you know, from a position of social capital are able to influence or endorse or veto securitization on behalf of others. So they might say, you know, we need to securitize the environment to save the poor, or on behalf of species or ecosystems and so on. So that's how I see those where I see those kinds of voices positioned in the climate emergency. Earlier I mentioned there are securitizing preemptors. It's a bit late for that in a way, because of course this whole narrative is already underway. You know, climate change rhetorically at least has been securitized. And I would say in many contexts, we have successful securitization, albeit it is of this non-exceptional variant. So all that remains for people like Donald Trump, for example, but there's a few others as well. Bolsonaro, I mentioned him, Sarah Palin. So it's definitely the minority, but I think what they definitely want to achieve is to preempt exceptional securitization, so that rather than the carbon regimes being voluntary as they are currently, you know, it's voluntary for states to bring down their emissions, and there are more sort of social norms that prevail in terms of whether a country has done that or hasn't done it, that it actually becomes mandatory in some form. Because as long as these norms are merely, are norms rather than laws, say, that are enforced, they, of course, are able to pay lip service to some of these and do no more. That's certainly what Bolsonaro has done towards the very end of his presidency. Okay, I have absolutely no idea how I'm doing for time, but let me do some findings. So I would say the new formulations allow us to cut through the noise. I think it shows how, but of course not why, it is possible that in spite of all of this noise, there is no exceptional securitization as yet. Some actors do exceptional things, yes, but they don't do it with the view to bringing down emission themselves, that is. They don't think that their actions will bring down emissions, while actors that are in a position to do something exceptional and that have declared a climate emergency have so far not done this. They are simply warning threateners or they're promising protection. And for now, they certainly are preferring to use ordinary measures instead. Okay, so that brings me to the end. Thank you for listening. Let me stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Rita, for such an informative and rich talk. It is indeed a significant contribution to the categorization of actors in the securitization process. So now we're going to start the Q&A and open discussion session. So please keep your microphones muted. If you have any questions, please send it to the chat box. Please, I would like the questions to be brief and to the point in order to give as much participants as possible the chance to ask and participate. Okay, so let us read the questions from the chat box. We have one question from Mu'tamir. He's asking, you discussed the top-down approach in the securitization process, emphasizing the role of states. Based on this, do you agree or disagree that state policies contribute to the problem? Additionally, in your opinion, should corporates have a greater or lesser role in securitization?
It's difficult. I always find the Q&A quite difficult. I have to confess. I mean, do I agree that state policies contribute to the problem? I mean, it depends on whether you mean that the securitization as it is currently done contributes to the problem, or whether you mean the fact that the securitization is lacking is contributing to the problem. I think that certainly, I'm not sure how to, what I think on this question, to be honest, but it seems to me that as we have it at the moment, whereby we have a voluntary carbon emissions reduction regime, that may very well not be enough. It seems that, yes, actors the world over have come around to the idea that climate change is a real thing and that something needs to be done, but everything is incredibly slow. You know, we always seem to be 10 years behind where we needed to be. So that certainly does contribute to the problem. Should corporations have a greater or lesser role in securitization? I mean, I think corporations certainly should have a greater role in being responsible for bringing down their climate emissions, and also, and not only that, in general, a greater environmental awareness in terms of packaging, in terms of the things that are being produced that nobody needs. But I'm not sure that corporations necessarily have a role in securitization, certainly not in terms of securitizing actor. They might simply be forced by possible securitization to behave in particular ways down the line.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you that sometimes it needs some thinking to try to categorize the actors like that and try to figure out which actor fits in which category. Please allow me to have a follow-up question on what Mu'tamir has said. If we take a look like again on businesses, let's say, for example, we have the polluting businesses who are oil and the green technology businesses on the other side, the green tech businesses. But if we take a company, for example, like British Petroleum, who is trying to claim that it is green or trying to claim that it is becoming more environmentally friendly.
Yeah.
Again, I think this would cause some you know, you need some thinking on thinking where exactly to deciding where exactly to categorize such a business like British Petroleum.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, but I think the question is, you know, do you want these actors to be able to conduct securitization? What would that even look like? You know, what would they? I can't. I mean, I struggle to see what that would constitute. It is rather that securitization would enable governments to regulate these actors better. I think it's probably that way around. But then, of course, the question is, to what extent would we want that? You know, because we value our capitalist freedoms, and we value being able to do all sorts of things that are carbon intensive. And therefore, to what extent would you want to, in a way, restrict these companies' kinds of behavior? So I think probably what needs to happen is that as industry changes towards becoming greener and we move away from fossil fuels, these companies become less important and less powerful. That probably is ultimately perhaps a better way. Does that make sense?
Okay, so yeah, thank you. So let's move to another question. Okay, so we have a question from Ida. Thank you, Dr. Floyd, for this excellent presentation. You mentioned many interesting points. I would like to ask you, how long does the securitization move take, and how long can the process itself last?
That's a good question. And it's very difficult to answer, I guess. But I mean, at the moment, I would say the securitizing move has gone on for a very long time, right? We have people reiterate this climate emergency message over and over. And of course, you know, we try to conceptually say one actor is a securitizing actor that does this, then something else follows, and we have these need categories. But the real world will always be messy. So you will probably always have, even as securitization proper is underway, so even as measures are adopted, you will still have the securitizing move. It will be reiterated many, many times because governments ultimately need to justify what they're doing continuously. So I think, you know, in theory, we can say first you have the securitizing moves, then you have the action, at which point we no longer look at the narratives because we're focused on the action. But in reality, I think it's probably messier than that. So there isn't, in a sense, that that strict difference in practice. But how long does it take? I don't know. I can't say, you know, it will last this long. But what's interesting, perhaps in this context, is that there is at the moment, certainly in critical security studies, some debate of whether the securitization of terrorism has ended. And there is some debate on, in a way, what is now the way forward for critical terrorism studies? Does it still have a role if the securitization of terrorism has ended? And of course, you know, you can ask yourself, well, how long was that? 20 or so years, where you had this narrative. I also think it isn't necessarily over, the securitization of terrorism, because all it would take would be some major event and it would be back. So it's a sort of recurring thing. But it's I think it's interesting to think in those time frames, you know, to sort of think, well, how long does it take? And I actually do something in my new book, something along those lines, where I'm trying to figure out because in the new book, I'm writing about morally mandatory securitization, so the duty to secure. So I argue, you know, if securitization is morally permissible, can it sometimes be morally mandatory? Can it sometimes be required of actors? And the question is, well, when is that the case? And I set out a whole theory when that actually is the case. And instrumental in this is that less harmful options have been tried and have been failed. But then there's a question, of course, how long for? Do these measures have to be tried? And then you can't put a time on it, because also it depends on the issue. You know, you might say you have an infectious disease, you try alternative methods other than securitization. You should be able to judge fairly quickly whether the rate of infectious diseases or of infectious cases has gone down. But with climate change, it will take you a year, 18 months, maybe longer, to really be sure whether the measures you are taking are addressing the problem, because you need to adjust whatever data you have for individual weather events and so on that are all playing a role in this. So it's a very difficult question to actually say it should be done for X amount of time. So all you can say, which is what I end up saying in the book, is that there needs to be a sufficiently long time gap enabling the measures to fail. But that, of course, is context dependent. But yeah, how long does the securitizing move take, and how long can the process itself last? The securitizing move, so in short, my answer probably is the securitizing move probably lasts as long as the securitization, and the securitization will probably last until the issue is, the problem is addressed, solved, neutralized. I mean, from a moral position, securitization should last no longer than until the threat is dealt with, because those are the parameters during which securitization is morally permitted.
Okay, next we have a question from, excuse me, from Johnny Pettifer. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Johnny. Great talk, thank you, Rita. As you know, we mostly agree on our readings of securitization. However, I wonder how are scholars not also be securitizing if they are analyzing normatively that an issue is a threat? If security is rhetorical, then surely scholars must be securitizers. Also, do we need to consider temporal and time in relation to securitization to achieve what we consider to be successful securitization, i.e. exceptional change? COVID was seen as killing people on the day, whereas climate change is at some point in the future, so people are perhaps less bothered.
Yeah. I mean, this issue, if security is rhetorical, then surely scholars must be securitized. I think that's true in some sense, and that's it. The issue here is, what do you think is the meaning of securitization, right? So if you think securitization succeeds at the point of audience acceptance, and that's all there is, and there are people who do believe that and who think language is performative in this way, they would then probably say there is no difference between a securitizing actor and a security analyst, and that every time you yourself write in favor of the securitization of climate change, you are also a securitizing actor. I mean, at the end of the day, these are labels, right? Nobody has a right to these labels in a way. But to me, it seems that there is a difference whether you are simply speaking security, or you speak security with a view to then actually doing something about it. And certainly, I mean, to me, securitization is more than just the rhetoric. To me, securitization is this, is that something is done, a policy change. Not necessarily extraordinary, but that something tangible is done that relates back to the threat. When securitization is understood as that, then of course you escape this normative dilemma, right? There's a literature on this. There was an article in the very early 2000s by Jeff Huysmans, which essentially wrote about this normative dilemma of speaking and writing security, you know, essentially saying this: if language is performative, are you not each time you're writing about security essentially complicit in the securitization? That was the accusation. And it was on this point then that the Copenhagen school said, what are we going to do about that? Let's focus on desecuritization. So that's when they said, each and essentially every time you talk about securitization, there's this implicit assumption that desecuritization is the better option. And that worked for a while, and it works for a lot of issues, but it doesn't work with climate change so well, because the majority of securitization scholars that work on climate change think climate change is a problem. Of course, that doesn't mean they think the issue should be securitized, but of course, securitization is really, all of this is really complicated, can take very different forms. It could potentially be a good thing. So therefore, then this whole desecuritization is always better doesn't work so well anymore. So there's a whole bunch of complicated problems tied up with that. Let me just look at the second question. We need to consider temporality time in relation to what we consider exceptional change. Maybe. I mean, this is more about, oh, I see what you're saying here. This is a different meaning of successful. You're essentially talking, the meaning of successful you have here is the conventional meaning of successful. So you're judging securitization in terms of whether it achieves its outcomes. But the meaning of securitization, of successful securitization used by the Copenhagen school is actually a different one. It would more accurately be described as complete securitization. So this is actually, they mentioned this just really at one point where they say lots of different securitizations exist, but the most interesting ones, this is loosely to paraphrase, are the successful ones, namely the ones that include extraordinary measures. So they don't really mean successful in terms of achieved objective, but successful in terms of followed all of the steps of securitization. You're nodding, so I'm hoping that makes sense. It's all very complicated.
Yeah, I can see Johnny is nodding. Okay, we have one final question from Nikos. Thank you for this very interesting talk. How do you assess the role of existing international law in addressing the securitization of climate change? From a critical standpoint, what modifications or new frameworks may be necessary to ensure it adequately responds to this global threat?
I don't know how to answer that. International law is its own beast. But I do know that there is, for instance, this whole debate about could we have an international law against ecocide, right? Which has also come to the surface again, in particular in the context of this dam in Ukraine. Whether that should be classed as an ecocide and what would that actually mean. There's an interesting paper in Ethics and International Affairs, I can't tell you who wrote it, on this whole issue of ecocide, where the authors are sympathetic to this idea, but essentially argue or set out multiple reasons why it wouldn't work. I mean, in some ways, you know, you can ask from the securitization perspective whether if there is such a thing as morally mandatory securitization, so there's a moral duty to securitize, you could ask whether that moral duty should be inscribed into international law. And then you could debate, I guess, the pros and cons of doing that. You know, whether that would actually achieve something, why would we feel the need of doing that? I think we always think that the law, in a way, is the solution because it's something tangible. But one of the problems, of course, with international law is unlike domestic law, is that it isn't really enforceable, not very easily anyway. You know, where's the police force that will go out and actually enforce it? That is the problem. So I think that it always sounds, it looks good, or it seems a solution. You know, we want a solution to this problem. So it seems if only it was law, it might work. And there might be something to that, but it may also not work because of the nature of the issue. So probably as domestic law, it would be better, you know, done domestically in different contexts.
Okay, so that was the final question, and we have a message from our head of department, Dr. Amani. She's telling you, thank you, Rita, for this very informative talk. Much appreciated by the British University in Egypt, Political Science Department. Hope you have a speedy recovery.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so of course, we please join me in a round of applause for Rita. Okay, you can just yeah, there you are. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Rita, and hope to see you again in another session.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you. It's our
Bye,
pleasure.
everybody.
Okay, goodbye.